So while we're waiting for more people to join us, maybe I'll tell you a little bit about myself, especially for those of you who are new, who haven't been to my webinar before. So my name is Yuliya. I'm originally from Novosibirsk, Russia. I was born there and lived most of my life there. Just by now it's over maybe more than half of my life. I've lived in several other countries. I lived in England, New Zealand for a little while, Turkey, and for the last year and a half, I've been living in the U.S. I live in Seattle, or near Seattle, which is in Washington State, and it's on the coast, on the west coast of the Pacific Ocean. So it rains a lot here. So right now it's raining. It's been raining for a couple of weeks now, and I think it's just going to continue to rain. So that's what winters are like here. I mean, it's not very cold, but it is pretty rainy. So yeah, some compare it to St. Petersburg, but I think St. Petersburg is colder. I mean, St. Petersburg, Russia. Actually, a funny thing is that in the U.S., as you guys probably know, U.S. is a country of immigrants, and so except for native Indians, most people, they came from Europe and all the other countries. And so a lot of people, what they brought with them is that they brought names. And so that's why New York is called New York. It's New York. York is a city in England. And it used to be called New Amsterdam because it was started by Dutch people from Holland. And so that's why there are a lot of English names, and there are some Russian names. So there is St. Petersburg in Florida. There is Moscow. Well, I'm sure there are a lot of Moscows, but there is one Moscow pretty close to where I live, Moscow, Idaho. So yeah. When I say that the climate in Seattle is similar to St. Petersburg, I'm talking about St. Petersburg, Russia, and not St. Petersburg, Florida. So I guess let's get down to business. And today we'll be talking about fluency. And, fluency seems to be a very popular concept for students and for teachers. And anywhere you teach English, any country you teach English, any setting, a lot of the times, you'll ask people, oh, well, why are you learning English? And they'll say, I want to speak English fluently. And so that seems to be a very popular goal. And I mean, that's how we can, and that's also a thing we say about people who learn foreign languages. We say, oh, she's very fluent in this language or that language. But fluency is not that simple. First of all, understanding what fluency is, because there are different types of fluency when it comes to skills. There is reading fluency, and that means how fast you can read, and other types of fluency. But today we'll talk about speaking fluency, which is what our students want, right? They want to speak fluently. But what is fluency? I mean, on the face of it, fluency seems simple enough, right? You just speak English, and you speak English quickly, and in order to become more fluent, you just practice, practice, practice. Easy, right? Well, if it was so easy, we wouldn't be here, we wouldn't be talking about it. So before we start, I want to ask you, what do you think fluency is? Just take 30 seconds and write the first thing that comes to your mind, because I can't hear you. The only thing I can see is what you're writing in the chat. So in a few words, tell me, what is fluency? Speed. Okay. Yeah, that's a very common thing to mention in connection with fluency. What else? What are some other things that you associate with fluency? I see somebody's writing something. So before I show you the definition, I'd like to hear what your ideas are. So let's see. What is fluency. And connected speech. Totally right. We'll talk about this today. Yes, you're right. That is a very important aspect of fluency. Okay, well, I see somebody else is writing something, so I'll give you a minute. And while I'm waiting for you guys to tell me what you think fluency is, I wanted to explain why I decided to focus on speaking fluency. I already mentioned that that's like one thing that's popular for students. Another thing is that, you know, when we ask somebody, do you speak a language? We say, oh, you know, do you speak this language? We don't say, do you write, right? Or something else. We say, do you speak a language? And so, you know, arguably speaking is one of the most important skills that you can get in a language, because that also involves, you know, the listening skill, and that also, you know, allows you to show your lovely grammar and vocabulary. Okay, I see somebody else. Ruslana wrote being natural. Okay, I like that. And you'll see that you're very close to the real definition. And so let's see. There are actually many definitions of fluency, and they all emphasize different aspects. Some of the aspects that are commonly sound native with pause. Okay, that's also it. We'll talk about pauses. But yeah, there are many aspects that different definitions emphasize, but some aspects that are often mentioned are speed of delivery and how automatic production is. But also, so here we go. If you look at the slide, we have two definitions here. Paul Nation, for example, says that definition is learners communicating with speed and ease without a great deal of effort and attention. So here we have the speed. And then another longer definition comes from Richard and Schmidt, and they say the features which give speech the qualities of being natural and normal, including native-like use of pausing, rhythm, intonation, stress, rate of speaking, and use of interjections and interruptions. So as you can see, all of the ideas that you mentioned, they're in here, which is great. And so what we have here is ease and speed and lack of effort. But where does it come from? How do we get that speed and ease and lack of effort? Well, popular opinion is that fluency comes from practice, lots and lots of it, right? The more you speak, the better you will get. I definitely agree with that, and many other people in the field have the same idea. For example, today we'll look at some activities that Paul Nation wrote a lot about reading and speaking and listening in the field of English as a second language. And so he strongly believes in repetition, and he says that repeated practice of the same material leads to fluent performance. And so we'll talk about that. But before we can get to how to develop fluency, I wanted to talk about some things that actually stop students from being fluent, right? And so some of the things that get in the way of fluency, number one is insufficient linguistic knowledge. And what happens is that students are trying to tell you a story, and they get stuck, right? And they're like, well, it happened to me today actually at work. I'm an interpreter, and they used a word that I forgot. I knew this word, but I just totally forgot. And I was sitting there going, so yeah, I did not sound fluent at all. And students can, and when that happens a lot, especially with lower level students, they can get into this habit of, consulting a dictionary, especially now where, you have dictionary on your mobile phone and it's just always at your fingertips. So they get into the habit of, getting into their dictionary, or they can get into a habit of always asking the teacher for help, because, teachers are the same as dictionaries, right? We're all walking and talking dictionaries, or, asking other people in class if they're studying in a class. And all that can definitely slow students down. They can, it will introduce hesitations and pauses into their speech. And this definitely creates an impression that a student is not fluent. And we'll talk a little bit later about how to deal with this, what to do when that happens. But for now, we'll move on to the second obstacle to fluency, and that's focus on accuracy. And, you know, fluency is often contrasted with accuracy. And so we have like a spectrum here. On the one spectrum, we have fluency, which is the ability to produce speech without a great deal of effort. And then on the other spectrum, we have accuracy, which talks about the ability to produce grammatically correct sentences. And ideally, we want to be both fluent and accurate, right? That's our goal. But in practice, when we're doing activities in class, we can't always have a focus on both. And what you get is you get some fluency activities and students saying, why isn't the teacher correcting my mistakes? You know, we've been speaking for so long and I'm sure I've made a million mistakes and the teacher hasn't corrected a single one. And this, especially often this happens in speaking clubs, right? If you've ever had to teach a speaking club, a lot of students will complain that we've spent 2 hours speaking, no error correction. And that doesn't mean that you never ever correct errors in fluency activities. It's just that your feedback may be delayed. I don't know if you've ever done this, but you know, when students are speaking, especially in pairs, you walk around and you write down some things that you hear that, you know, you'd like to correct later, or maybe you'd like to see if students know how to correct them themselves. And then after you do the activity, you give them feedback. And what I like to do is to write these things on the board, but without saying who these mistakes belong to. And more often than not, students will be like, oh my God, I said that. You know, they'll be excited that their mistake is featured on the board. And then you can address those rather than, you know, stopping somebody in the middle of a sentence and be, no, he go, no, he goes, you know. And I'm not saying that you never ever correct mistakes. It's just that when we are working on on fluency, you know, it's better not to interrupt the students in the moment. Okay, and we'll talk about this a bit more because the second part of the seminar will be more about practical ideas. For now, we're still kind of talking about theory a little bit. Okay. So the next group of factors that can affect fluency is affective factors. So everything to do with affect is everything to do with sort of everything to do with non-linguistic factors, with emotional factors. And so these things can have a negative effect on developing speaking fluency because they stop learners from wanting to speak English. So one thing that can happen is students can have anxiety related to speaking English in front of other people. This can happen, you know, especially in a group setting. But it could also be, you know, students are fine in class and then they go out into real life and they have to talk to their colleagues, or, I don't know, they go traveling and they get that anxiety. Students are afraid of making mistakes. And, you know, I don't know if you've ever heard this, but students will say, oh, you know, I'm not ready to speak English yet because I have such a low level, and I'll speak English once I get to, you know, a higher level. And another thing is students sometimes they don't want to work in pairs because they think, okay, well, my teacher speaks wonderful English, you know, I want to speak English just like my teacher. This person next to me has the same level of English as me, maybe a little bit better, maybe a little bit lower, but still, you know, I don't want to speak like him. So why should I spend my time speaking to this person next to me, right? And so this can also stop them from getting adequate speaking practice. They have, it's funny, sometimes, you know, I've also heard students say that, like, oh, I'm going to catch my student's mistake, the other student's mistakes. Well, mistakes are not fleas, you know, they're not viruses. You can't catch them really. I mean, you could probably copy somebody's mistakes, but, you know, we really we really want the so it's not something that students should really be worried about, but it does happen. Instead of students practicing getting lots of speaking and fluency practice in pairs, they're like, I don't want to talk to this person. I'd rather talk to the teacher. And in which case I say a couple of times I actually had to sit my students down and do the math and be like, look, there is one of me. There are, I don't know, 8 or 5 or 10 or 15 of you. And this is how long our lesson is. And so if I speak to each of you individually, you'll get this much speaking time, right? I don't know, let's say we have 20 students and 40 minutes. So if I talk to each of you individually, you'll have 2 minutes of speaking time. That's it. Actually, you'll have less because I'll be speaking half the time. However, if you speak in pairs and, you can speak for the whole of 40 minutes. Well, if I speak for a little bit, but still. So yeah. Okay, so these are some things that can sort of scare students and prevent them from doing from developing fluency. And there's another thing that also negatively affects fluency, and that is students trying to build sentences from scratch. I'll tell you what I mean. Even beginners can normally say, my name is, right? So this is one of the first things that we teach beginner students. So even somebody who's had like 2 lessons of English can already say, hi, my name is Yuliya. How are you? Right? And they shouldn't stop there because, in real life, nobody builds sentences word by word. Like maybe if you're really thinking about something, you might be choosing your words more carefully. But think about it. Like you don't build sentences word by word. You're speaking in chunks. And we'll talk about that later. But yeah, if you were to build sentences word by word, you would speak much slower and you would also lose that link in between words. So Ruslana today mentioned, or somebody else in the chat, Ariana, said that one aspect of fluency is connected speech. And that's true. And if, for example, do you know what I mean? Do you know what I mean? Do you know what I mean? Which sounds more fluent? The last sentence I said, right? And so by building our sentences word by word instead of using chunks, we will speak slower and we'll lose that connected speech aspect. Right, but that's not all. There are more things that stop us from being fluid. And actually, the last thing I wanted to talk about is silent pauses. Now, imagine you're talking to somebody and you say, hey, what's your favorite movie? And they look at you. And look at you. And look at you. And you're like, what's happening? Did you hear my question? Did you understand my question? Are you going to answer my question? Hello, is anyone home? Right? And so a more natural reaction to this, even if you really don't know what to say, would be something like, oh, well, that's a good question. Huh. Interesting. Well, I guess I don't really have a favorite movie. And so I've just spent like about a minute not really saying anything, but it didn't really look like, I was gone. So you could see that I heard you, that I understood you, and I was just kind of thinking of what to answer. And so basically if you have frequent pauses, but also if you have prolonged pauses, all of that is going to sound unnatural. And, in the Russian language, we have this thing called parasite words. And so students are often afraid of using fillers because they think, that's bad language. But these things is what makes us sound natural. And, or sometimes the other thing can happen. Learners can overuse fillers. Like in English, there is this word like, and I'm guilty of using it a lot, and saying, well, it's like, we like went there and it was like great, but like, I don't know. So we can fall into the extreme of underusing fillers or overusing them. And we'll talk about how to address that in just a second. So we talked about some things that can stop us from being fluent. And before we get too sad about it, let's talk about what we can do to become more fluent and how to help our students become more fluent by looking at the main components of speaking fluency. Let's see. Number one is chunks. I like this word, chunks. Chunks, a more academic name for chunks is formulaic sequences. So formulaic sequences, they are words that are stored and retrieved as a single unit. Remember my example with what's your name? Or my name is? That's a chunk. And chunks could be sentence stems. Sentence stem, it means it's just like part of a sentence, like can I have? And then after can I have, you can have something else. Or I'd like to, or would you like to, or have you ever? Chunks also include collocations, things like make dinner, do housework, and discourse markers. Discourse markers are these words and phrases that they don't have that much meaning on their own, but they help us connect ideas, or they can serve as fillers, words like, you know, well, really, and things like that. And the thing about chunks is that they actually contribute to automaticity of production. So it means that it means that we don't have to, remember I was talking about building sentences from scratch, word by word. Well, the more chunks we have, the less we have to do that, and the less we'll have to pause and search for words. And the funny thing about chunks is that sometimes they can actually create an illusion of fluency. So I used to live in Turkey, and the town where I lived was a pretty small conservative town, and nobody spoke English, and definitely nobody spoke Russian. And so, you know, I had to learn Turkish, and by the end of my time there, I got pretty good with Turkish. But especially the first year was pretty hard. And also, you know, sometimes I didn't want to talk to people in Turkish because it was too hard. And so I learned how to say I don't speak Turkish pretty well. Türkçe bilmiyorum. And so, you know, somebody would stop me in the street or somewhere, and they would start asking me all these questions like, oh, you know, where are you from? Or, you know, something else. And I would say, Türkçe bilmiyorum. And they would be like, really? Well, imagine if somebody, you know, if you wanted to speak English to somebody and they would say, I don't speak English. You just said that. And that sounded very fluent. And what happened is that I learned this phrase, Türkçe bilmiyorum, I don't speak Turkish. And I just, you know, I repeated it over and over and over again. And I got very fluent in this one phrase. And so that's why nobody believed me that I couldn't speak Turkish. Right? And so that's why, you know, having these chunks, knowing these chunks, and practicing these chunks will definitely contribute to the idea of fluency. And in my last I was talking a little bit about the approach to teaching languages here in the U.S., especially in one place where I was teaching Russian. And so they didn't want us to focus on grammar. They wanted us to focus more on chunks and teaching students sentence stems, saying things like, I don't know, I really like, I don't like, and things like that. And while I do think that for most adults, you know, explaining grammar is not, and analyzing grammar is not necessarily bad, I did find it useful to arm the students with these tools, with these almost ready-made phrases that they could just, you know, add a word or, you know, an adjective and a noun to, and that's it. They have a ready-made sentence. So there are lots of phrases in textbooks. Most modern textbooks, they use this approach of teaching students chunks. And so you can definitely, next time you're preparing, if you're a teacher and you're preparing for a lesson, I'm sure you'll notice this in textbooks, but also if you're creating your own materials, this can be something to think about, you know, having those chunks, especially for lower level students. So yeah, that's pretty useful. Okay. Another component of fluency that we'll talk about is pauses. And let's see, I'm just looking for my little cheat note here. Right, and we just talked about how pauses, you know, if they're very long or if they're very frequent, they sound unnatural. They don't make you sound fluent. And so in order to sound natural, pauses should be placed sort of not in the middle of a sentence, but at the intersection of clauses. And also in order to avoid prolonged silent pauses, fluent speakers use fillers, right? And these are just the sounds like and words like I mean, well, and this vague expressions, things like sort of, like, kinda, and time-buying devices, things like, well, let me see. And you know, this is something I often teach my students who, you know, who are preparing for exams like IELTS and TOEFL. And I always tell them, you know, especially in TOEFL, when you're being recorded, you have a very short time period in which to make your answer, right? So you definitely don't want to spend the whole time going, yeah, I don't know, that's a good question. But at the same time, nor do you want to just sit there in silence, you know. And so when used in moderations, these things are great in creating the illusion of fluency, right? So these things are more, you know, strategical pauses and fillers. They're less about fluency maybe, and they're more about creating the illusion of fluency and giving yourself some time to remember that word or think of an answer. And, you know, as somebody who talks to native speakers all day, every day, I live in the U.S., so many people start their sentences with, So, you know, you say to somebody like, oh, hey, what are you doing this weekend? Well, I think we're going hiking. And that's a totally normal thing to do because, you know, the person I asked, they were probably thinking about something else, or, you know, maybe they weren't expecting me to ask these questions, so they don't really have the answer. Even though they know what they're going to do this weekend, they don't have the answer ready. So they do need a second to collect their thoughts and to be like, okay, Yuliya just asked me this. What am I doing? We're going hiking. So, yeah, we're going hiking. So these things are totally normal, and it's a good idea to tell our students about those things to help them sound more fluent. Another thing that is important for fluency, I guess that's it. So we talked about chunks, and we talked about pauses, right? And so another thing that we can do for fluency is, aside from telling our students about pauses and fillers and teaching them chunks, is teaching them some communication strategies. What are communication strategies? These are things that, techniques that can be used to help learners get their message across, even when problems in communication happen, because that happens. And in my experience, they can help learners sound more fluent by avoiding those pauses that we just talked about. It stops them from getting stalled in search of a word, right? When there is one word that you forgot and you're just sitting there, and you know you can't move on. And what are these communication strategies? One of these strategies is circumlocution. I know it's a long word, but all it means is paraphrasing. And so, you know, let's say you forgot a word, and instead of sitting there, or, you know, asking somebody or looking it up in your dictionary, you can always explain it. And you can be like, I need to buy this. It's a thing, it's a thing for shaving. What do you use for shaving? The razor. Right. I need to buy a razor. So, you can actually teach students some phrases. So one grammar topic that's helpful in this is, relative clause. See, I was talking about getting stuck on the word. I almost forgot it. So relative clause, it's a thing which, it's a person who, it's a place where. Or, even if you don't focus on a specific grammar point, just telling them, right, you get stuck, get around this word, explain this word, use another word, use a synonym. And there are some great activities for teaching this, because they're games. There are lots of variations of the same idea. So let's start with taboo. Have you ever played taboo? I'm sure you have. So the idea of taboo is that you have a word or a phrase. You have to explain this word or a phrase without using it, right? And sometimes what you can do is you can actually also include some other words that you cannot use. So somebody says they don't have a sound, they don't have video. What they can do. I'm just gonna write a quick answer to that. Okay. I'm just telling them to use a different browser. Right. Yeah, so let's say you want somebody to explain Starbucks, right? I'm showing you this cup because it has a Starbucks logo. So you want somebody to explain the word Starbucks, and so obviously they can't use the word Starbucks, but if you wanted to make it difficult, you could also say, don't use the words tea, don't use the words coffee, and don't use the word Seattle, because the first Starbucks was opened here in Seattle, right? So there are, if you search online, you can search for printable taboo, and there are already, some ideas you can find online. You can create taboo sets for your students because you know which words, you want them to revise. So there is that. Another fun game is called Pass the Word or Pass the Bag. And so what you do is you get some sort of container. So it can be a plastic container or a bag, plastic bag, or a hat. Doesn't matter what. You write some words and phrases on little pieces of paper, and this can be words and phrases, again, like that you studied in class that week, or, you studied them last year. So whatever words and phrases that are relevant to your students that you want them to focus on. And so you'll need a container, you'll need some words on small cut-up cards, and you'll need some music. So, something that you can play on your phone. You just need one song. And so you put students in a circle, you give one of the students this container or hat or a bag, whatever you're using, you play the music. While the music is playing, the students are passing and passing and passing the container from one to another. As soon as you stop the music, the person who is left holding the container has to take out a card with a word, and then they have to explain this word or phrase to the rest of the class. So, the idea of the game is pretty simple, and sometimes you don't even have to play the music. The music is just to make it more fun and, create some excitement in the classroom because everybody's like, I don't want to be left holding the bag. Keep passing it. So, and you can definitely have fun with your students by stopping the music on the same student several times, and he or she will be like, why me again? So that can definitely be fun. Another fun game that I really like in class and I play it a lot is called Hot Seat. And so what you need to do is you need a board for this game. If you don't have a board, you can always use a large, like an A4 piece of paper or something like that. And so you need a chair, and this is better played in a group. So you'll need a chair, and you get one student, a volunteer, or somebody that you make volunteer, and this student comes to the front of the class and sits just like I am sitting now, facing the class, and then with their back to the board. So imagine that the board is behind me. Again, if you don't have a board, it could just be the teacher standing there with a piece of paper. And so you choose a word or a phrase that you write it, and you write it on the board. And again, the student who is guessing can't see it. And sometimes you have to watch them like a hawk and be like, hey, everybody, don't let this person turn around. So you write your word or phrase either on the board or on a piece of paper that you're holding, and then the rest of the class has to explain this word or phrase to the student. And, this can be a lot of fun because everyone is yelling. And I mean, obviously you announce the rules and no one can speak Russian or whatever language that you share with the students. And then they can't obviously use this word, or they can't show this word. So again, they have to use this paraphrasing in order to explain it. And you can always, at the beginning, set it up by just using a very simple word. You can be like, okay, well, what if I wrote banana here? How could you explain it? And, have students come up with something simple like, oh, it's a fruit. Monkeys like this fruit, and it's yellow, and it's long, and it's tropical. So, and then they'll get the idea. So that's a lot of fun. Not the last time, but there was one time when I was playing this game with a group of teenagers, and they got so excited. One teenager, she sort of flipped back in her chair and she fell down. I felt really bad. She wasn't hurt or anything. She was okay, and they thought it was funny. But that's how excited people get about this game. And sometimes you'll start playing it, and everybody's just sitting there. People are shy. They don't really want to speak in front of the class. And then by the end of the game, everybody's yelling. It's a really good energizer that you can use at the beginning of the class. That was my favorite time to use this game. I was in Turkey. I was teaching at a university, and I had really large classes of like 20, 25 people, and somebody would always be late. And so I would start the class by playing this game, and it would give us an extra 5 to 10 minutes and kill several birds with one stone. First we would revise some of the vocabulary from previous lessons. We would give people time to arrive, and, I didn't want to start an important topic if so many people were late. And then, of course, we were working on our communication strategies. And then the last thing with paraphrasing, simple vocabulary cards. And so you could do all of these fun things. You could play taboo, you could play pass the bag, you could play hot seat. Or you can just do a very simple activity of writing some words and phrases on a piece of paper, and you can cut them up into individual cards, or you can just have I don't have little pieces of paper, but just like even a quarter of this, where you have 5 words, and then you put students, depending on how big your classes are, or even if you're teaching one-to-one, you give 5 words to your students, and then you have 5 words if it's a one-to-one situation. And then if you have a group, again, depending on how many students you have, you give, you divide them into student A and student B. All student A's get 1 card with 5 words. All student B also get a card, but with different words. And then you give them 5 minutes or so to where they have to explain the words to each other, and the other person has to guess, right? So this isn't as exciting as hot seat or any other game where, you can play with the whole class, but it's still pretty effective in teaching and reinforcing this paraphrasing skills. So, yeah. And another type of communication strategy is time-bound devices. And I talked about this a lot already. And these are phrases that students can use when they don't know what to say, right? So things like, oh, well, let me think about it. And I don't know. That's a good question. And even though these things can kind of sound fake, But like I said, these things that are used a lot realistically. And if you have time, I know teachers are always busy. We don't really have much time to ourselves, but next time you're watching a movie or a TV show, see if you can notice some of these things. What do people say when, when they want to stall for time? So this is definitely helpful. Okay, moving on to other ways to develop fluency. Another thing that can help students be more fluent is include a preparation stage in your speaking activities. What do I mean by that? Remember I talked about how insufficient linguistic knowledge can stop students from being fluent, especially if it's a task where they have to deliver a monologue or they have to speak for a long time. And so before students speak, even if it is a conversation, if you give them some time to prepare, this can really help them be more fluent when they're speaking. So preparation ideas could be things like brainstorming, right? So before students are going to speak about something, you can brainstorm as a whole class, either to get ideas or to get some language, right? So you can say, let's say you guys are going to describe, you're going to talk about personalities. You're going to talk about what kind of personalities people have. And we talked about this in class, so you should know these words, but let's quickly brainstorm. Like, what are some words that we can use to describe people? What are some, positive adjectives? What are some negative? What are some neutral ones? Are there any idioms we know to describe people? So just, very simply providing them with some ideas, with some words that maybe they either forgot or, they don't really know. You can also allow them to take notes. But with taking notes, especially if they have to give a little monologue or give a presentation, with notes, there is always a danger that students will write something down. In fact, that they won't just write something down. There's danger in that they will write everything down, right? They'll just write a whole page and then they'll just read from this page, right? And then we're running into London is the capital of Great Britain territory. Right? This is how even in university, that's what we did. We had to memorize a topic and then you had to repeat the whole thing back, which isn't necessarily terrible because it does teach you some important vocabulary and it does teach you some of those chunks that we talked about. However, we're practicing fluency. We're not practicing reading skills or memorization skills. And so what I often do, and let's see if I have anything here, what I often do to in order to prevent students from do that is that I give them sticky notes. So let's say, I'm teaching a class and everybody in class will tell me about a person they admire, right? And first we brainstorm and talk about the type of people that other people admire, like celebrities and successful business people and scientists. Then we talk about some vocabulary, so things like admire for, achievements, some stages from people's lives. And then I say, okay, well, now I'm going to give you some time to think about who you admire, think about what you're going to say, so you can take some notes. And then I give them sticky notes. And you see this isn't a very large piece of paper. So even if the students wanted to, they can't write the whole thing here and then read it, right? And so this is you don't have to use fancy sticky notes. You could just cut up some draft paper. And so, this way they can still take some notes. They'll still have some ideas, maybe some important vocabulary. And this will help them feel more confident, and this will also help fluency because they won't have to be like, what else was I going to talk about? Oh, right, I wanted to talk about, how this person invented something. And I already mentioned some key vocabulary. And so, providing some language support by pre-teaching or reviewing key vocabulary or key grammar. This would also be this would also go towards helping maintain and support fluency in students. You could, for example, let's say students are going to hold a debate, right, where one person will express an opinion and then others have to agree or disagree with this opinion and then say why. So before you actually hold this debate, you could ask learners to suggest some ways on how to agree and how to disagree with somebody's, and then maybe practice, right? And you could be like, well, you know, they're obviously, you could say, I agree, I disagree, but you could also, depending on the level, suggest a few more phrases and then actually practice and be like, hey, lemons are the best fruit. And then have some students say, you know, I totally disagree, or, you know, that's not right. And some other phrases before you actually get them to hold a debate. All right, what else could you do? Except for include a preparation stage and provide language support, you could also provide opportunities for repetition. So remember at the beginning I talked about the idea that many people have that fluency is a simple matter of repetition and practice. The more you practice, the easier it'll get. And to some extent it is true. And the more you practice, the easier it does become. And in order to help students practice, there are several ideas, several activities that you can do with them. One of them is 4-3-2. And Paul Nation came up with this activity, with this technique. Basically, it's where they repeat the same thing 3 times. And 4-3-2 refers to minutes, so it's like 4 minutes, 3 minutes, 2 minutes. But depending on the level of your students, 4 minutes can be a long time. And so you could adjust it to, let's say, like 2 minutes, 1 minute, 30 seconds, or like 3-1. You could definitely change that. But the idea is that students repeat the same thing in a longer and then shorter and a much shorter period of time. And so that it doesn't get boring saying the same thing again, and again, they change partners, change audience. And so basically how it works in practical terms is that you have your classroom and you can either set up something called a fluency circle if you have enough students. So, you know, you have a circle of, let's say, like 1, 2, 3, 4 students, and then you have an outer circle of another 4 students. And so, you know, student 1 is facing student 1, student 2 is facing student 2, student 3, student 3, student 4, student 4. And students have to talk about the person that they admire. And remember, in the previous slide, we talked about how you would give them time to prepare. You would allow students possibly to take notes. You would help them prepare linguistically by brainstorming some words and phrases they can use. So the students are ready. You know, they're ready to talk about the person they admire the most. And yeah, it's very popular, 4-3-2, because Paul Nation is a very prominent writer. I love everything he writes. I can, at the end of this class, if somebody's interested, I can write you some books, names of some books that he wrote. And he also has a lot of articles, so he's really amazing. But anyway, back to the activity. The students have their speeches ready. They sit facing students, and you say, okay, you will now tell your partner about the person you admire, and you have 4 minutes. And in this cycle, only student 1 will speak. So like, no, hold on, not student 1, but you have, right, AB, student AB, 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 right? And you say, only student A will speak now, and you have 4 minutes. And again, we can reduce this to 3 minutes or 2 minutes. You set the timer. while the students are talking, you walk around and you monitor, because remember, this is fluency practice, so you're not stopping anybody to correct mistakes. You're just writing down some things to address later. At the end of the 4 minutes, your timer sounds, or maybe you have a bell or a gong, or maybe you whistle. You stop the students, and then you have them shift. Or maybe if they're in a circle. So now you have a new student A facing a new student B, and so on. Now we do the same thing. Again, the student A speaks only student A, but this time they have less time. They have only 3 minutes. Repeat. Student A speaks, but only for 3 minutes. You walk around, monitor, write things down. At the end of 3 minutes, again, students move. They now have a new partner, and now they speak, and they only have 2 minutes. Or maybe if you started working with 2 minutes, now they only have 30 seconds. And then once student A has delivered their talk 3 times to 3 different people, and it's been progressively shorter and shorter, you do the same thing with student B. So now student A can relax and listen, and only student B talks. And this is a cool activity. And the idea is that, first of all, repetition promotes fluency, because the more you're repeating the same thing, the easier it'll be for you. And also time pressure, because they have less and less time to talk. Time pressure also forces the students to be more fluent. And then because they're changing partners every time, they're not, it would be boring to say the same thing to the same person over and over again. So we address all this. And this, like I said, this activity works better for monologue tasks, although we can talk about some other techniques that work well for different tasks. Okay, another technique that also uses the idea of repetition is pyramid discussion. And pyramid discussions are great for tasks where students have to negotiate or where they have to select something. And how it works is that, let's say, you're deciding what 3 people in your country should receive a medal. I don't know, like a presidential medal. And you tell students, especially if it's definitely for a class, for a group, not for one-to-one. So you tell students in your class, this is what we're going to do. We're going to select 3 people that are going to receive a president's medal. So sit down, think about it, and write down a list of 3 people. And so you have students sitting individually and writing down a list of 3 people. Then you say, okay, you have your 3 people. Now work in pairs, and now you have 6 people, right? But you only need 3 because you have 3 people and you have 3 people. So work together and decide which 3 people you will keep. So students have to, they have to present their people, their candidates, and then they have to explain why they chose them. They have to say, I have this person, he's a great singer, people love him or her, and I think that's a really good candidate. So they do that, and they negotiate, and they choose 3 people. Then you say, okay, now this pair has 3 people, and that pair has 3 people. You combine them, now you have a group of 4, and once again, they have to make a list of just 3 people out of 6. And once again, they have to negotiate. They have to repeat their presentation. They have to say, oh, hey, this is the person I chose, and that's why I chose them. So again, we're having that repetition, but because they're talking to different groups of people every time, it doesn't get boring. And then eventually, the idea is that eventually, you could stop there and you could say, okay, now you guys, the 4 of you, present your 3 people, and then another group will present their 3 people, and then together as a class you will choose the final 3. And while the students are deciding this, they're still repeating, right? They're still talking about why this particular candidate is worthy of the medal. And so this is an example of a task which involves both negotiation and selection. Other examples of tasks like that involve selection could be, it's an activity where students are packing to go on holiday, or they're preparing for a trip to a desert island or a camping trip, and you give them a list of 20 items and they have to choose just, 3 or 5 or 1 or whatever. And so again, it starts with individual and then pairs and then going into smaller groups. Okay, so some other practical ideas for activities that promote fluency is Fluency line. And here you can actually see a picture of students, actual students, these are my students from Turkey, doing a fluency line. And the idea is that you have a group of students that you divide into, and you put them, they're standing and they're facing each other. And you could give each student a question. So either you give the student a question or a student writes a question. It depends on, what grammar, what vocabulary you're practicing. But the idea is that a student asks the same question over and over again, and it gives them that, repeated practice. So it could be something like, let's say you're focusing on present perfect that week. And so you could have students doing, have you ever been abroad? Have you ever, it could be the questions that the students wrote themselves. And obviously you've checked them for errors. And it could be somebody saying, have you ever been to Russia? Have you ever eaten crocodile? And things like that. And so the idea is why it's called a fluency line is that you give the students, you also like the technique on writing the pyramid of why I am right. Introduction is the basement, body is the main part, and top is conclusion, which stands on the argument. I love that idea. Definitely. Although you're kind of talking about writing and, we're talking more about the speaking, but I definitely like this idea and I'd like to learn more about it. But anyway, back to fluency line. Students are facing each other. You give a signal and students have, let's say, 1 minute to both ask their question and listen to the answer and then have another person ask them the question. At the end of 1 minute or whatever time limit you set, you have one student from the end of the line move to the front of the line, and then everybody else has to move. And boom, everybody has a new partner. So you repeat it. And it depends, again, on how much time you have and how much practice the students really need. But you could repeat it over and over again until everybody has talked to everybody. And so this is a great way also to kind of energize students and to get them moving in class instead of just sitting all the time. And a great way to get them to practice asking the same question over and over again without it getting boring, because they're always asking a different person and talking to new people. We don't really have much time left, so let's see. We have time for another activity, and that's speaking using a dice. Ooh. Okay. So you need a dice, that's like, what you use when you play board games. And what I like to do I have any pictures with this? I guess not. What I like to do with the dice is to set set some rules and say, okay, if you roll the dice and you get 1 or 2, you have to answer the question. If you get 3 or 4, you have to ask the question to the person on your left. And if you get 5 or 6, you have to ask the question to the person on your right. And that's just, it's not really a game. It's just like a technique to get students talking instead of them sitting there with a list of questions and being like, who should ask? Are you asking? Am I asking? What's happening? This is so awkward. And so when they have that dice, it's much easier because, okay, I rolled 1. I'm going to answer. I rolled 4. I'm going to ask the person on my left. So here is my question for you. And another fun activity for developing fluency is role plays. And the thing with role plays, when you find them in the book, they can be really weird and really fake and, not very relevant to your students or, their lives. And so what you could do is you could get you find a role play in the book, which is kind of great, but it doesn't really work for your setting. And you could change it just a little bit to make it a little bit more relevant. So this activity came from a textbook. I don't even remember which one, but I remember thinking like, oh, my students are not going to care about this, How can I make them care? And I changed everything to Novosibirsk because I was living and working in Novosibirsk at the time. And so I made it about a park in Novosibirsk that everybody knew. And so, again, because this was a role play, I still gave my students some time to prepare. We still did some brainstorming about, ways to agree and disagree, because in this role play, they had to talk about whether construction of a shopping center would go ahead, and they had to express their opinions. And so they needed to say, like, oh, I think it's a terrible idea, or like, I completely support this 100%. So, we brainstormed some language that they could use. I gave them some time to prepare and take notes on their position based on their role, what were some things that they would say. So it totally worked great. And then finally, another thing that can work great for fluency is board games, because just like the dice, playing with the dice, it can give some structure to speaking activity. It can kind of remove some of the anxiety, when students, when they feel like, we are practicing speaking right now, I should be speaking. What if I make mistakes? The teacher is listening to me. There are so many things happening. I don't really, feel like talking right now. And so having something like a board game can really make the students feel more sort of comfortable, less nervous. And so this way they can really focus on speaking and communicating and not worrying so much about making mistakes. So, what will the teacher think? What will the others think? And so, again, board games, you don't really have to buy something like Monopoly or, buy expensive board games. They are easily downloadable online. So the one on the left, you see a template for a game called Snakes and Ladders. And I just downloaded it online. I just typed into Google Snakes and Ladders free template. And then on the right, you see how I changed it a little bit. So I wrote some things like ask a question, answer a question, and, I don't see what else I have here. Oh, yeah. Ask a question, answer a question, challenge, surprise, ask your teacher for a prize. So these were some of my own little touches that, and then where it says ask a question and answer a question, I wrote my own list of questions that, came from lessons that I was teaching to the students. And so it worked really great. So this is pretty much all that we have time for. And I hope that this workshop gave you a good overview of, what fluency is, what gets in the way of fluency, and then how to overcome this by teaching students some things about fluency and about, what makes us fluent. And I have a list here of some websites that I'm actually going to copy them and put them in our in the chat. And then you guys can go on some of the games that I have here. And some of the ideas that I have here, they come from those websites. So I'm posting in the chat right now. Let's see. Oops. That's not what I wanted to post. Let me try again. Yeah. So I'm copying them here. And then, here we go. Okay. Oh, it looks like I can only post one thing at a time. So maybe okay, I'm gonna, while I'm doing this, and this is pretty much it, while I'm doing this, if you guys have any questions or any comments, now would be the time to send them as I'm doing this. And then if anybody wants to learn more, or if you have any questions, I'm also going to post my email at the end of this chat. So you could also feel free to email me and be like, hey, you mentioned Paul Nation. Which of his books do you recommend that I read? Or, hey, you mentioned chunks and formulaic sequences. Where can I learn more about that? So definitely feel free to email me at, here we go, yuliya.speroff@gmail.com. Here we go. So that's my email. Yeah, so I'm just going to give everyone a few minutes so that you can write things in there. Like I said, questions, comments, suggestions for the topics of next webinars. I'm totally open to suggestions. What you guys want to know about? What are some problems that you're having as teachers? What are some things that you need ideas for? I'm happy to help. How to work. So we talked about fluency. Now you want to work on accuracy. Okay. We can see if we can do something about that. Okay. Well, thank you for listening and participating. And especially thank you to Ariana for being such an active participant, and Ruslana. I appreciate you guys asking the questions and making comments. And everybody else, thank you for tuning in and spending your Wednesday afternoon with us. So, yeah, have a great rest of your day, everyone, and see you soon. Bye. I'm going to disconnect.